Chapter 11 is on families. In many ways, this chapter is a continuation of the chapter 9 discussion, where we were focused on how the definitions of love, sexual intimacy, courtship, and marriage, how those definitions are socially constructed and therefore change over time. And we ended that discussion from that chapter by introducing the concept of the modern married individual. So we're picking that line of discussion back up in this chapter. And this chapter begins by discussing the benefits of marriage, then to what extent are those benefits gendered, and then we're going to focus explicitly on the concept of division of labor and what that looks like in different families in terms of their decision making in regards to how they divide both paid and domestic labor. So, beginning with the fact that, even in a society where marriage is promoted as the normative adult pathway, in terms of people's romantic and intimate relationships, there still are, in fact, benefits associated with both being single as well as being married. Those benefits of being married include things like dependability, pooling economic resources, social approval. The benefits of remaining single are things like, privacy, economic autonomy, which basically means, not having to run your economic decisions, by anyone else. You are the primary decision maker. Freedom from responsibility to care for a spouse, independence. So there are benefits, to both. And at this time period, we have more single people than we ever had before. And so in the last few decades, what has been a concern for sociologists is what's called the decline of marriage. And it's worth noting that although some of this has been overstated and overblown, particularly in popular media sources, there has actually been a decline in the percentage of couples who choose marriage. So let me go ahead and talk about that for a second. Another way that this is sometimes referred to is as the retreat from marriage. And it's just worth noting that, during post-World War II, there was a dramatic increase in children and marriage. But then after the funny 50s, as we discussed in chapter 9, there was then this dramatic decrease. And what's happened is, though marriage is still common, individuals are marrying later and divorce is more frequent. And these two trends contribute to the fact that now, more so than ever, there's just less adult time being spent in a married relationship. And so you can kind of see that if you look at that chart, kind of the lime green bars, they represent living in an individual household, and the share of the population that's living in an extended household. So you can see that those bars have increased, particularly beginning in the 1960s, and that the married couple bar has decreased. Once again, you can start to note that trend in the beginning in the 60s. And then, as we'll talk about, single parent households, they had decreased, during the 40s and 50s and 60s, and then they've now been increasing in share. And sometimes students ask me, what is non-family group? And so that's like living with roommates. And unsurprisingly, to those of you who maybe have ever lived in a big city, or know someone that maybe lives in LA, that with the rising cost of living, people are living with roommates, particularly single people, later and later in their life, as a way to share cost. So before we go back to that slide discussing modern marriage, let's just talk a little bit about that whole marrying later. That it's not that people are not getting married, but they are getting married significantly later. And so the average now is about 7 years later than what it was in 1950. And you can see, if you look at that bottom graph, that traditionally men have always been older than women at the age of first marriage. And this is because of, in just traditionally, the expectation that men are going to be a breadwinner means that they have to be more financially stable and secure in their profession and economic situation than women would be. Where, especially pre 1970s, the expectation that a woman was expected to contribute to the household through paid labor was just not the expectation. Instead, it was expected that she would bear children and take care of the home. And in that sense, if anything, being younger as opposed to older was seen as a benefit. And so you see that, while women have, always been younger than men at age of first marriage, you see both of those lines do a dramatic dip during the 1940s and 50s, and because that's that World War II period that we've already discussed. And then after that, after the 50s, you start to see that increase for both men and women. And, the expectation is, maybe even at some point, the two might intervene, in which case that old relationship between gender and age at first marriage will no longer exist. So why are people delaying marriage? Several reasons. Kind of a primary one, particularly for women, is that they're spending more time in education, getting an education. And this is because the expectation that they're going to be in the labor force is, for a lot of women, that's just the expectation. So they're investing more in their education and their careers. Birth control technology and legal abortion, not something we necessarily want to think about. To what extent were marriages in the past due to unplanned pregnancy, whether they were shotgun weddings or not? There's certainly, with the amount of social stigma around single, motherhood and premarital births, we just know that, unexpected pregnancy was definitely a contributing factor to early marriage in past decades. And then, of course, economic conditions and uncertainty. People are just less likely to, hitch their wagons together, during times of recession and times of economic uncertainty. A lot of people just make the decision that that's not a good time to build a household. And so, that certainly has shaped as we've had the Great Recession, that's shaped and then of course the recession that we're kind of currently in, that's shaping the marriage patterns of people. One consequence of this marriage postponement is a drop in overall childbearing. To what extent is that a positive or a negative? Probably has a lot to do with, what you feel about demographic trends in general. But it also means one positive consequence of this is there's more freedom in forming relationships. If you aren't holding yourself to some standard that you have to get married by 24, 25, you're free to date people for fun. You're free to have relationships with people that you don't necessarily see yourself marrying, but nevertheless, there's someone that you care about and someone that you want to spend some time with in your life. So, this isn't all negative. This isn't all doom and gloom. So let me go back to my first slide. So while there's been a decline in marriage, it doesn't really seem like it's an ideological retreat. People still want to get married. They're just getting married largely later in life. And part of the kind of reason behind this is because marriage still remains one of the most important aspects of an individual's life. The state of being married is an important part of a person's identity, and that holds true even in modern societies. And although the reasons why people might pursue marriage have changed, they've become more individualistic, more self-centered. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, like, they get married because it relates to their personal happiness or their personal goal fulfillment. as opposed to, the practical, logical reasons, that we talked about in chapter 9. So people are still making that choice, and that's true even in a society where there are other life choices available to them. People are in fact still choosing marriage, and why? There are positive reasons, and that are largely socially acceptable, and there are negative reasons that are less socially acceptable. Meaning, if you were to share that you got married for this reason, you can maybe expect a little bit of pushback or judgment. So, the number one positive reason, of course, is like love and companionship, commitment, personal fulfillment, continuity. You want to make the relationship permanent. Negative reasons, social legitimacy. I want society to approve. Social pressure. Everyone's bugging us about getting married. Economic security. And isn't that, once again, this just emphasizes the social constructed nature of this topic. Marrying for economic security 150, 200 years ago was pretty much the standard. Now, of course, if you say that you're marrying for social security purposes or economic purposes, people are likely to be pretty judgmental of you. And so, there are a lot of reasons why people still choose to marry. And it's noteworthy that they're still making this choice in a society where there are other choices available to them. And although there is still social pressure to marry, it's nothing like what it was in the past. And that's because we can think about modern marriage existing in a context that can be described as the deinstitutionalization of marriage. Marriage used to be an institution that was supported and enforced by a lot of other institutions, like church and, even labor force, where there were rules about, what types of jobs married women could or could not do. And, there were, financial incentives given to men for them to encourage marriage. Marriage was enforced by like the banking industry, where, of course, in the past, single women could not do things like have their own bank account or, get a mortgage in their own name. So marriage itself was wrapped up in all these other social institutions. But modern marriage, has largely, a lot of these constraints, have been removed. And so that means that modern marriage is more of an option than a necessary tradition. You can have a full life. You can have a life where you can have a job and you can have your own home and you can even, have a kid on your own. That is a possibility in today's society, much more so than in previous ones. And so Andrew Cherlin, a sociologist who coined the term deinstitutionalization of marriage, he makes that point, that the formal and informal rules of marriage have become weaker, and individuals no longer need to or are required to get married for economic security, social standing, or even having children. So in that way, it is kind of amazing, if you think about it, that many individuals, in fact, still choose marriage as their option despite this deinstitutionalization. So why is the institution of marriage so desirable even after it's been deinstitutionalized? Well, sociologists have identified 3 sociological reasons to marry. And sociological reasons mean these are reasons that exist out in society in the social context. So we're not talking about individuated reasons like, I love this person, I want a committed partner. We're talking about what are the larger societal reasons. And those reasons include incentives and social pressure. So incentives are rewards for getting married, and they're also penalties for not getting married. So both of those types of things go under incentives. But these would be things like some of the additional rights that state and federal governments provide to married couples, things related to parental rights or social protection. The fact that the labor market also provides incentives. These could be like insurance benefits, employer perks. tax breaks. All of these are incentives to get married. Then there is social pressure, and this social pressure can be both real and perceived. But oftentimes, at a certain point in a couple's history, they might find that they are being encouraged to get married by family, peers, and the media. But then, even outside of their own inner circles, there are professional family experts who similarly extol the virtues of marriage. This could be like your counselors, social workers, the talking heads on TV. And so even though the pressure from family ties and religious communities have weakened in the recent decades, they still remain somewhat influential. And, to what extent are they influential probably varies by the person. And then finally, the final kind of social, sociological reason why people marry is imitation. So, with so many choices in life to choose from available in modern society, people often just subconsciously rely on what they see around them. And marriage is still an important part of the culture. And in some parts of the country, it is highly visible and even more symbolic, which is why we see marriage rates vary greatly between different parts of the country, right? The likelihood of being 25 and married in the deep South is different than if you're in a big city on the West Coast or in a small town in the Midwest, right? All of those are differences. And part of what drives those marriage rates isn't just different cultures in those places, but the fact that in those cultures, you have individuals making choices, and those individuals' decisions kind of rub off and shape your own individual decisions. And so this is why, even though many young adults are delaying or postponing marriage, the majority do still end up marrying at some point, choosing to conform to common cultural patterns. And that's just not surprising, because most of us do conform to a certain extent most of the time. So you've decided to get married. And there are sociological reasons shaping that decision, whether you realize it or not. What benefits do you have? How do sociologists approach the topic of what benefits exist for people who are married? And there are entire, fields, subfields in sociology where people are answering that question. So I'm just going to touch very lightly on some of that research. There are certainly, and your book kind of starts off by also pulling from, your chapter starts off by pulling, from some of these research findings, especially in regards to happiness, which we'll talk about in a second. So there definitely seems to be a marital benefit to health. And specifically when you're comparing married and versus single men, there seems to be a strong benefit to being married. And I give you this little infographic that's pulling from some research that makes that point. Whether you're talking about cancer death risk, whether you're talking about heart surgery, whether you're talking about reduction in aggression or criminal activity, there is a benefit for married men. They live longer, they are less likely to engage in crime or aggressive behavior like getting into fights. Part of this has a lot to do with, what we'll talk about later in the chapter, that they are living a less, in a lot of ways, with the day-to-day activities being taken care of by their wife. Because it's worth noting that a lot of this research does come out of research on heterosexual marriages. But, with a lot of the kind of their day-to-day, cooking and cleaning, those types of things being taken care of by their wife, they're usually living better lives, eating better meals. We know that married men they go to the doctor more regularly. They go to doctor follow-ups more regularly. They adhere to pill regimens more strictly than single men. So all of this results in them, in fact, living longer. What about for women? Well, this is where it gets kind of tricky, because although married women, if you're just asking, people to self-evaluate, their health or even their happiness, the there might be a distinction between, what married women say and what single women say. We don't actually see it in their health outcomes. And in some health outcomes, single women actually are healthier than married women. And we'll come back to this discussion as to why that might be when we talk about the gendered division of labor. For money, and I just chose, there are a lot of different ways you can think about this, but certainly when you're pulling your resources together, especially if both people are working, that's going to result into a household that doesn't just have more money coming in, but likely they also have less money going out. And this is because the amount of money that it takes to, to upkeep and maintain one household is less than the amount of money it would take if both people had their own separate households. And then you factor into the fact that, for single people, they are, more likely to dine out, they're more likely to travel, they're more likely to, take part in like entertainment and dating. Because they're dating, they're more likely to spend more money on personal care. So it isn't just that married people share and pool their economic resources, but in many ways, it also, means that as individuals, they cut down on their expenses. Than if they were, maintaining single households. And then finally, we have happiness. And this is really the research that, your book is calling upon at the start of the chapter. And so it's just worth noting that, when we ask people how happy they are, married people do tend to say that they are happier than non-married people. However, the gap between married men and married women, and men married to women, women married to men, there is a gap in their self-reported happiness. And that if you compared women married to men to women married to women and women who are single, there isn't this sizable, distinction between women married to men, their happiness compared to those other groups. And if you're comparing them to women married to women, they actually say that they're less happy. And so, that gap in their happiness raises the question if marriage might be more beneficial for men than it is for women, or if it might be more pleasurable for men compared to women. And so we'll delve into that more deeply. But just consider, what are the sociological sources of these benefits? We've talked about some health benefits, some money benefits, some happiness benefits. What are some of the maybe societal factors that underlie these benefits? So one thing is behavioral change and responsibility. Because marriage is often seen as a marker of adulthood, for a lot of people, it does change their behavior. They have a sense of responsibility and obligation to someone else, and this leads them to maybe make better decisions in regards to their health and their safety. But especially for men who have a much greater propensity because of, how we define masculinity in our culture, because they had a greater propensity than women going into marriage to be engaging in risky and unhealthy behavior. This is part of why, they most benefit from those types of changes. If marriage changes, both men and women's behavior, it changes men's behavior often more, in a more advantageous way that we can measure. The kind of second source of marriage benefits is cooperation. So I was discussing this when I was discussing, the benefits in regards to money. Spouses can share and pool resources, and they participate in a type of family division of labor. And so this doesn't just kind of impact their wallets, but it also can impact their time. And the example, a male breadwinner can work to earn more income in an occupation outside of the home because he is married to a stay-at-home wife who takes care of the housework and the childcare. And so if he would have remained single, yes, maybe he wouldn't have had kids, but he would have still had this housework, this cooking and this cleaning that he would have either A, had to spend money on to outsource, or B, use his time when he is off from work to handle. And so, it's not just that by pulling their resources together that these couples can make more money, but by the decisions they make in regards to how they divide labor, certain members of the family might find themselves with less stress and more free time than if they were still remaining single. Now, of course, we'll discuss that, this can be very gendered. And then finally, social status, which notes, although this is much less tangible than other benefits, it remains an important reward for marriage for many individuals. And, it might explain especially those differences in happiness between singles and married people in a society where marriage is still promoted as the normative adult pathway. Even if it gives you no other real tangible benefit, by conforming to that norm, you get a certain, stamp of social approval. And maybe, more importantly, the opposite, when you don't conform to that norm, even if you feel personally okay about your decision, it might become draining to still deal with other people's disapproval, to answer the questions, why aren't you married yet? Do you never want to get married? Those types of unwanted intrusions and judgments of your life. And so this might play into why people who are even maybe not in the most happy of marriages still, might feel a small sense of satisfaction that at least they are married. And of course, that's going to be more true in a society that pushes marriage as opposed to societies that don't. Now, a caveat, when we're studying things like happiness, health, wealth, and the marriage, how marriage impacts that, sociologists need to be certain that we are not participating in what's called the selection effect. And the selection effect is the problem that occurs when the cause being studied has already been determined by the outcome. Basically, maybe it's not that marriage makes people happier, healthier, or wealthier, but that happier, healthier, wealthier people are more likely to get married, in which case the fact that they are then happier, healthier, wealthier than singles is not because of the marriage, but because they were already those things before the marriage even happened, and the marriage just intensified the effect. A way around that is to try to do a longitudinal study so we can determine the sequence of events, right? So if we ask someone, how happy they are every single year, and then they get married in year 7, if there is a marital effect on happiness, then we should see whatever their average level of happiness, whatever that had been, before they got married, we should see that increase. If it really is the marriage that's increasing their happiness. If they've always been a pretty happy person and they're still the same level of pretty happy after marriage, then that really isn't the marriage. That's just who that person is. So, given the fact that a lot of this research isn't longitudinal, it does need to come with that caveat that to a certain extent, this could be a little bit of selection bias. But for the purposes of this class, where we are most interested in the gender disparity in these benefits, this doesn't really overly impact what we are going to focus on.